If I can get through all the material in this one lecture, this will be our last video for the semester. And then really all you have left to do is a quiz and test 4, and then your final. So let's see how much I can get through today. Okay, so where we left off was kind of here, kind of how you got to be a sex at all, and then all of the terminology related to gender, sex, and sexuality. This is a fantastic infographic that I found on one of the science research websites. And it talks about sort of gender, non-binary, transgender, and then all of the different things that can impact sex determination in humans. It's really fascinating. There's a lot that, I mean, I'm not going to test you on this at all, but intersex conditions, the chromosomal complements that cause them, different things that can happen during puberty. If you're interested, you can just shoot me an email and I'll send it to you. It's not comprehensive, but it's pretty good. Okay, so where we are going to start today is we are going to start with typical adult female sex anatomy. The anatomy, the anatomically typical female. Let's talk about female reproductive system anatomy a little bit. First off, do not be offended, please, if I over-explain these things, because there's such an incredibly broad spectrum of how much sex education people had based on sort of where they were educated. So I will define things that you already know. I may over-define things that you're very familiar with, but I'm trying to just sort of hit every kid, including the kids like me who had abstinence-only education in K through 12 and then had to do a lot of learning real terminology later. Okay, so let's start with sort of the functions of the female reproductive system anatomy, things that you know. So the female reproductive system anatomy has basically the same functionality as the male in that you have to produce your sex hormones. In females, it's primarily the estrogens and then progesterone, and then producing gametes. In females, the gametes are called ova, or oocytes. In males, of course, they're called spermatozoa. And we'll get to males after the female reproductive system anatomy. But in addition, one of the things that makes the female reproductive system really interesting and also complicated is that in addition to these two functionalities, it also has to be able to prepare for and support a developing embryo and fetus all the way to birth. So one of the reasons that people tend to be a little less knowledgeable, there are probably quite a few reasons, but people tend to be a little less knowledgeable about the female reproductive system is because it is mostly internal, right? A lot of the structures that go on are actually internal. So you can't really see most of the female reproductive system. So if we look at the female reproductive system, really all you can see is the vulva from the outside. And we'll talk about that in just a second. So I want to just briefly take a minute to talk about the menstrual cycle. And what's actually going on with the menstrual cycle. Not that I'm going to test you over this in a lot of detail, but I kind of want you to understand that really what the menstrual cycle is the ovaries sort of telling the uterus what is about to happen. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview of what kind of goes on with the menstrual cycle. What goes on with the menstrual cycle is that as the ovary, and this is a coronal section of an ovary, as the ovary starts to produce a oocyte that is going to be ovulated, what it's going to do is it's going to communicate to the uterus that there is the possibility for fertilization and possible implantation. And Implantation, of course, would be a pregnancy. And so what it does is it communicates via hormones. Primarily the hormone that is going to communicate to get ready for a possible implantation is the hormone progesterone, as in progestation, as in pro-pregnancy. So as you get ready to ovulate, your progesterone level is going to go up. And that progesterone is going to tell the uterus to thicken and increase blood flow to the wall of the uterus. And then what's going to happen is it's going to stay thick for a while to make sure that if fertilization and implantation occurred, it was ready. But after it gets out of the window in which fertilization or implantation could have occurred, your progesterone level will drop again, and that will cause menstruation, in which you slough off the lining of the uterus every single time. So really what the menstrual cycle is the ovary telling the uterus what to do. Okay, so there's a whole lot of complex physiology to it, but that's good enough for now. So I want to start with, as far as the anatomy goes of the adult, I want to start with the vulva. If you have kids in your house and you do not want them to see the adult female external genitalia, this is the time that you might want to move them. Okay? All right, so first off, let's get some proper terminology. This portion of the female reproductive system, of the female anatomy, is not called the vagina. This external structure that you're seeing there is actually called the vulva. Used to be called the pudendum. They're trying to get away from that term because pudendum is from the Latin for shameful, which is what they originally sort of named in the female genitalia in Latin. But now this entire structure that you're looking at is actually the external genitalia, or the vulva. Okay, so let's look at some anatomy of the vulva here. So what we see here is the mons pubis, and the mons pubis is basically the pubic mountain. It is a fatty, rounded pad that's overlying the pubic symphysis, which seems to have developed because humans, when they have sexual intercourse, sometimes do smash two pubic symphyses together. And so the development of a fat pad can reduce the possibility of damage. Males have a little bit of fat there as well, but not as much. And then we move down to the labia. Labia means lips, and we have the labia majora, which are the outer lips. Those, remember, are homologous to, the labia majora are homologous to the scrotum in a male. Okay. And after puberty, generally speaking, they are going to have pubic hair. And then the labia minora are the thinner inner hairless folds. They are homologous, remember, to the skin that surrounds the shaft of the penis. Now, the entire shaft of the penis is not homologous to the labia minora, but the skin is the same skin as forms the labia minora, the skin around the shaft of the penis. Okay, then what we have in this region right here that's inside the labia minora from here to here, this region right here is called the vestibule, and vestibule means waiting room. So here's your waiting room, and there's your doorbell right there. Okay, so the vestibule houses the opening to the urethra. That's the external urethral orifice. And the vagina, that's the vaginal orifice right there. It also, you can see the clitoris, right? And the prepuce is continuous with the labia minora. Okay, so, and then there are some glandular structures, which you probably didn't learn before, that are associated with the vestibule. First off, there are two little openings, very difficult to see in this picture, but there's two little openings that are at the bottom or dorsal side of the vaginal orifice on either side. And what those are, those are the openings to the greater vestibular glands, which are behind these purple bulbs. We'll talk about those in just a second. The greater vestibular glands are homologous to the male bulbourethral glands. And upon sexual arousal, a typical anatomical female will secrete a clear lubricating fluid from the greater vestibular glands, which will help to lubricate the opening of the vagina. Okay, let's see. Then this one is still up in the air, how many women have these, but it is more than 0, and this figure didn't come from your textbook because it isn't in your textbook. There also, at least in some women, let's look at a mid-sagittal section here, is at least some glandular tissue, sometimes not an entire gland, called the Skene's glands or paraurethral glands. And the Skene's glands are homologous to the male prostate gland and in the same place as the male prostate gland would be. And they actually open into the vestibule near the external urethral orifice. They actually open into the urethra. And we'll talk about these a little bit later. The Skene's glands in women who have Skene's glands are responsible, at least in part, for the legendary female ejaculation. And those would be in the wall of the connective tissue between the vagina and the urethra. Cool? Okay, so that's the paraurethral or Skene's glands. And then last but not least, we run into our first erectile tissue in the female. Many people did not realize that females have erectile tissue as well. But all of these structures that you're seeing in purple, in blue, and in pink right here are all part of the erectile complex of the female. The first ones right here are the purple ones, and those are in around the vestibule. They would be behind the skin right here, behind the skin of the vestibule. Those are called the bulbs of the vestibule. They are erectile tissue, and they are homologous to the male corpus spongiosum. In the male, the corpus spongiosum ends up surrounding the urethra. And in females, of course, the urethra ends up separately during embryonic development. So this erectile tissue right here, what this does is when a woman is aroused, it means that the opening of the vagina is tighter because these are erect. And it helps to grip the penis and increases the likelihood of ejaculation. And anything that is pro-ejaculation during intercourse is pro-evolution of the species, pro-survival of the species. And they say it's probably part of the larger erectile complex. All of this purple, blue, and pink. And we have a model of these, and I'm wearing, can you see? I've got a clitoris necklace right here. The erectile complex right there. All of that is part of the larger erectile complex. And so sometimes when people say clitoris, they mean all of the erectile tissues. Okay, so now, since we already did the bulbs of the vestibule, let's talk about the clitoris, the entire structure of the clitoris. Basically, what the clitoris is the body of the clitoris and the erectile tissue within the body of the clitoris and the glands of the clitoris. Let me blow it up a little bigger. And the glands of the clitoris, right here. Oh, shoot. Okay, so here we are right here. So the glands of the clitoris, the tip of the clitoris right there, is homologous to the glands of the penis. So let's remind you of what that looks like. So here's the glands of the clitoris. It's homologous to the glands of the penis. There's erectile tissue within the penis, and the erectile tissue within the penis is the corpus spongiosum, which surrounds the urethra, and then paired corpora cavernosa. And the paired corpora cavernosa are homologous to the erectile structures within the body of the clitoris. Okay, so the clitoris is kind of roughly homologous to the penis, with the exception of the fact that the urethra doesn't end up in the clitoris, right? And one of the erectile structures that ended up in the penis is actually down here in the bulb of the vestibule. So the history of the clitoris being taught is really, really interesting. Most of it is internal. So it's really like an iceberg. Really, the only part of the clitoris that a lot of times you would see externally would be this portion right here, the glands of the clitoris. But it is erectile tissue. So it's like an iceberg, right? Just tip of the iceberg sticking out, but a whole bunch under the water. The structures of the clitoris have been known and then forgotten and known and then forgotten throughout history. As a matter of fact, Grey's Anatomy, not the show, the book that the show was named after, depending on whether we were in a very expansive time about knowledge and in sexuality or a very narrow time about knowledge and sexuality, the clitoris actually appeared in that anatomical textbook. It was kind of the Bible for anatomy for quite a while. And then it disappeared. Like it disappeared in the 50s, 1950s. And then it came back, and then it disappeared again in the 1980s. And now, of course, with the advent of the internet, it's going to be very difficult to erase that knowledge. So why? The clitoris has no reproductive functionality with the exception of female pleasure. So it doesn't participate in ovulation, it doesn't participate in pregnancy, it is not necessary for any of those things. It's only for female pleasure. And as a matter of fact, the glands of the clitoris, the teeny tiny glands of the clitoris, has about 8,000 sensory nerve endings, which is actually more compact nerve endings, making it more sensory than the glands of the penis. So, and of course, when the woman is not aroused, it is covered to greater and lesser degrees with the prepuce, which is basically sort of a hooded covering, skin fold that goes over it, homologous to the prepuce of the penis a little bit. It has a body, and it has the body of the clitoris, has the glands of the clitoris, and the body is just the shaft portion of the clitoris. And then it has these two little guys right back here, which are called crus, or crura is the plural. And so let me sort of show you how this works. It works the same way as a penile erection. So the crus or the crura are pushed back against the bones of the pelvis, right? And when you start to increase blood flow, and the crus or the crura are actually connected to the body of the clitoris, imagine it's kind of like blowing up a pool float while keeping it pushed against the fence. So the pool float was folded over, right, and it was pushed against the fence. And then as you start to blow it up, what's going to happen is it stands up. So you use the crus or crura for leverage to actually cause the body of the clitoris to become erect. So if you look at the clitoris from a mid-sagittal section, when a woman is not aroused, it's actually folded over, and when a woman becomes aroused, it actually pops up. Okay, so that is the clitoris or the clitoral complex. All right, so now let us move on to the ovaries. All right, so the ovaries, find sort of where they are with reference to everything else. Okay, so the ovaries, so we've kind of been on the mid-sagittal or medial, right? The ovaries are over here. They're much tinier than I expected them to be when I actually started looking inside humans to find the ovaries. They're little, and they kind of look like large curd cottage cheese to me. Their weird texture does. So here are the ovaries right here. They are still within the abdominopelvic cavity. They are homologous, of course, to the testes. They develop in a different hormonal environment than the testes, and they differentiate into ovaries. So here's one. Now, interesting thing about the ovaries is a couple of functional things and a structural thing. First off, their functionality is basically they produce the gametes, which are ova, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But they also produce estrogen and progesterone. They're homologous to the testes, but the anatomy is also really interesting because the ovaries, actually are not directly attached to the uterine tubes or fallopian tubes or whatever you want to call them. So here's the ovary, it's actually separate. And then the fallopian tube is right here, or the uterine tube, or sometimes called the oviduct. And they are not actually stuck to one another. So when you ovulate, and we'll talk about ovulation, you actually ovulate into the peritoneal cavity, and you sort of hope that the uterine tube will pull the oocyte into the uterine tube. Okay, so they don't come into direct contact with the uterine tube, so the oocyte is actually ovulated into the peritoneal cavity, and it must be coaxed into the tube. They call that the courting of the oocyte. And in just a second, I'll tell you how that works because we'll get to the tissues. Okay, so as far as blood supply to the ovary goes, the blood supply to the ovary is primarily by, here's the ovarian artery and the ovarian vein. Those go through the suspensory ligament and kind of behind the uterine tube to deliver most of the blood supply. But then, and the ovarian arteries are the female version of the gonadal arteries, right? And the ovarian arteries are going to branch off of the abdominal aorta. Sound familiar? And then there's also a branch of the uterine artery, and the uterine arteries come off of the internal iliac. And a branch of the uterine artery actually gives rise to some blood supply that will give more blood supply to the ovaries. As far as nerve supply to the ovaries, they have motor innervation from the autonomic nervous system, primarily controlling blood flow to them. And they also have visceral sensory innervation, and that visceral sensory innervation is the reason that some women can actually feel it when you ovulate, because this actually has to bust the oocyte through the outer wall of the ovary. Okay, so now let's look at the tissue layers of the ovaries. It's not as complicated as it originally looks because I don't make you label everything in here. So first off, oops. All right. So first off, we're going to go from outside to inside. The outer layer that you see right here of the ovary itself, right here, called the germinal epithelium. The germinal epithelium is the simple cuboidal epithelium on the outside of the ovary. It is in contact with your parietal peritoneum, okay? Continuous with your parietal peritoneum. And then as we start moving in from there, we're going to run into, this is called the tunica albuginea. And it's a coating, connective tissue coating. You have the tunica albuginea as well in the testes. So the tunica albuginea is the connective tissue coating that's just deep to this epithelial tissue. And then we run into the two big layers of the ovary. So this guy right here, the layer in which meiosis occurs, meiosis and then maturation of the oocyte and then ovulation. So it goes from a circle all the way from here, all the way around, and then it starts over again. This outer layer is called the ovarian cortex. This is where gametogenesis or oogenesis occurs. And so what is going to happen, and I won't make you label anything other than the layers here and the tissues that's in your notes, but what happens in a typical anatomical female after she hits puberty, generally speaking, one of these little structures right here called primordial follicles or ovarian follicles, one of those is going to start the meiosis process each cycle, 28-ish days cycle. So, and hopefully you guys remember meiosis from 1610. What you do with meiosis is you take a typical human cell, which is 46 chromosomes, and you reduce the chromosome amount and number by half. So when you, for instance, ovulate an oocyte, you do not want it to be 46 chromosomes. It needs to be 23 chromosomes because, of course, the sperm that's going to fertilize it is going to provide the other 23 chromosomes. So what's going to happen as you go through from here is you are going to reduce to 23 chromosomes. So you're going to go from having a diploid or 2N cell to a haploid cell, and then you are going to ovulate that. And then if that one got fertilized, it would have the proper number of chromosomes. So the ovarian follicle, it is surrounded by follicle cells, and these follicle cells are going to start to go through meiosis, and then these big things are going to support the developing oocyte And this is called a follicle right here. And then the follicle actually stays behind, and then you ovulate the oocyte. So let's talk about a little sort of myth. Actually, it's not exactly it's myth. It's just not quite true. It's truthy, but not true. So you have probably heard many times that women are born with all of the eggs they're ever going to have. And that's not actually true. They're not born with all of the eggs they're ever going to have, not all of the oocytes. They're born with all of the primordial follicles that they're ever going to have. But we have plenty. You are born with 1.5, if you're a woman, you're born with 1.5 to 2 million of those primordial follicles. And the follicles can each go through meiosis to make an oocyte. Now, in a typical woman's reproductive life, she is going to ovulate only about 400 of those, right? So you have a lot of extras. So the rest are going to degenerate and be reabsorbed. This is called follicular atresia, and it just happens to everyone. So what is true and what people are talking about is that you are born with all of those that you're ever going to have, and they age with you. So if you are, if I remember the data correctly, if you have a pregnancy early rather than late, so let's say ridiculously early, like 16, like my mom, or really late, like into your late 40s. So if you have a pregnancy really, really early, what happens is these are very likely to go through meiosis correctly, and you get 23 chromosomes and everything's great. But then as you age, these age with you, and their likelihood of meiotic mistakes, chromosome abnormality, goes up really dramatically. And I think these numbers are close to right. Don't quote me on the specifics, but the trend is right. At age 16, I think, the likelihood of a chromosome abnormality coming from the mother into the fetus is something like 1 in 2,400. And most of those will just be spontaneously miscarried because your body figures out something was wrong with it. And then by the time you're 45, I think the numbers the last time I looked were something around like 1 in 12. So, and again, a lot of those would be spontaneously miscarried as well. But the issue is that these age with you if you are a woman, okay? So, what will eventually happen is, of course, that will be ovulated. And this ovulation process busts through the oocyte, busts through the wall of the ovary. And then, if all goes well, it would get picked up into the uterine tube. Fertilization generally happens right about here in the uterine tube. And then if it was fertilized, it would start to go through cell division, 1 to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 8, 8 to 16, whatever. And then it would implant in the uterus and cause a pregnancy. But let's look at ovulation a little more closely. So here's what ovulation looks like. And then this was a series of images taken with a camera, laparoscopically, when a woman was being given drugs like Clomid that will cause hyperovulation in preparation for fertility treatments like IVF. I don't know what she actually did, but this is what you're actually seeing. This actually pushes out the side and makes a little bubble, and then this thing pops off. And so this is kind of a weird picture, but you can actually see. So this is the ovary. This is the little bubble that's pushing off the side. And then this little guy right here is the ovulating oocyte. Kind of cool and a little bit weird, right? Okay, so now as far as the parts of the ovary, so we did the cortex, and then the inner portion right here is the medulla. So cortex and medulla. The medulla is not like anything particularly special about the ovary. It's got the blood vessels coming and going, nerves coming and going, and lymphatic vessels coming and going. So like most things with two layers, cortex on the outside, medulla on the inside. As far as the parts of the ovary, so when you look, when you look, so this is a posterior view, this is an anterior view. Okay, so the hilum that you're seeing right here is where all the tubes come and go from, so the ovarian hilum. And then the cortex and the medulla. Okay, so the hilum is right here, and the tubes are coming and going from the hilum, and you can see this around here. All right, so now how do the ovaries stay in there if they're not like attached to the uterine tubes? And so there are a couple of different sets of ligaments that are holding on to them. Stop doing that. Okay, so this guy right here is called the ovarian ligament, and it hooks the ovary to the uterus. It's not a tube, it's a ligament. Okay, then this broad ligament goes back behind and kind of supports them from the backside. And then this guy right here, and the broad ligament is also supporting the uterus, actually more supporting the uterus than the ovary. That's really irritating. Okay, so, and then this guy right here, the suspensory ligament, although you can't see it, it actually hooks to the ovary on the backside, and it actually suspends the ovaries from the body wall. So the broad ligament, the suspensory ligament, and then the ovarian ligament. And then the last little tidbit about the ovaries here is just to talk about ovarian cancer, which we talked about all the way back at the beginning of the semester. With ovarian cancer, it is an interesting disorder because with ovarian cancer, it's actually not any of the really unique tissues of the ovary that tend to become cancerous. It is generally occurs in the germinal epithelium around the outside, so not like the meiotic tissue or anything. It is the fourth leading cause of cancer-related deaths in women, and although it's not as common as breast and cervical cancers, it has a higher mortality rate because remember me saying that what happened in the germinal epithelium, since it was in contact with the peritoneum, would be misdiagnosed for quite a while as, for instance, like digestive complaints, or you would think that you were having reproductive complaints, but not like cancer. So it usually gets diagnosed at a later stage than do other cancers, and most of these cancers are of the germinal epithelium, as I mentioned. Okay, so now let us move on to the uterine tubes. Sort of commonly called fallopian tubes, but they're moving away from using terms like that. So the other common term for them is oviducts. And really what these are is the pathway that the oocyte after ovulation will take to get to the uterus, where it will either implant or be sloughed out. Okay, so the uterine tubes, so you're looking at a posterior view right here. So this is a posterior view of the vagina, the uterus, and the uterine tubes. So really, if it would be reaching back to the ovaries back there. So if these are the uterine tubes, and I'm looking at an anterior view, they reach back to the ovaries. So here's the ovaries right here, and it's reaching back. And so basically these guys are going to start out near the ovary with this broad area called the infundibulum, and the infundibulum has fimbriae. Fimbriae means fingers, okay, on it. And the fimbriae are not always in contact with the ovary, but when the ovary is secreting high levels of progesterone, it tends to fold over and form a tighter seal. It's not completely sealed though, otherwise you'd never have ectopic pregnancies. Okay, so, and they run up and then they run lateral to medial. The functions, this is the general site, usual site of fertilization. It does not usually occur in the uterus. Fertilization occurs out here in the uterine tubes. And then the fertilized egg starts to go through cell division as it makes it down the uterine tubes. So fertilization usually occurs here, and that's the direct path for the egg or embryo to move through the uterine tubes to the uterus and then therefore the vagina. Okay, as far as the tissue layers of the uterine tube, if you looked at the tissue, I won't make you look from this perspective, but I do want you to talk about what they're, to think about what they're made of. The outer layer is the visceral peritoneum, right? Because they're going to be covered with visceral peritoneum. There's a middle layer that's actually smooth muscle so that these can actually contract. and cause sort of the peristaltic wave that encourages the oocyte to make it to the uterus. That's the muscularis layer. And then there's an inner layer, and the inner layer is ciliated simple columnar epithelium, which we learned about all the way back in the beginning of the semester. So the cording of the oocyte really consists of muscular contraction that creates a wave in the fluid, and then the ciliated cells waving that direction as well. And that's called the cording of the oocyte, and that will occur, generally speaking, best under high progesterone situations. Okay, and then if you look at the portions of the uterine tube, you can see the infundibulum, and then this curved portion, which is the most likely site of fertilization, is called the ampulla. Okay, and then it starts to get a little narrow as the isthmus, and then it gets really narrow as the uterine part. Okay, so the isthmus, and then you've got the uterine part, and the uterine part is really where this ends and the uterus begins, and then you're in the uterus after that. Okay, so the cording of the oocyte I already talked about. So I want to talk about pelvic inflammatory disease as it relates to this, and then ectopic or tubal pregnancies, which may be related to pelvic inflammatory disease. Okay, so fertilization, as I mentioned, tends to occur up here. And first of all, the egg is the biggest cell in the human body. I'll show you relative sizes of egg and sperm here. Where are you, egg and sperm? Okay, so these are relative sizes of egg and sperm. It's a huge cell. It's almost visible with the naked eye. You almost don't need a microscope to see it. So that oocyte, or egg, I lost my place. Okay, so once it gets fertilized, it will start to go through cell division. 1 cell to 2 cells, 2 cells to 4 cells. And by the way, this is mitosis. After fertilization, no more meiosis during this particular portion of a lifespan, but mitosis. So you'll start going through cell division or mitosis. And as you do that, you actually get bigger. That is all well and good if the woman's reproductive tract is wide enough for that to occur. But if something happens that actually scars the tube, and remember, scarring tends to narrow tubes and sometimes make them kink, what can happen is the egg can have trouble making it through. And that can result in either the egg or the embryo can have trouble making it through. That can result in either infertility issues and or tubal or ectopic pregnancy issues. So let's talk about it. So what can make this tube be more likely to be scarred? One of them is this broad term called pelvic inflammatory disease, or PID. And pelvic inflammatory disease can, but doesn't have to start with an STD or STI. But however it got in there, whether it was a digestive pathogen that made it into the vagina from wiping inappropriately, or a urinary pathogen that made it into the vagina after a urinary tract infection. And it's not necessarily from wiping improperly, but it can occur. Or it was an STI. However you got a pathogen into your reproductive tract, the pathogen is not limited to the vagina. It can make it up past the cervix into the uterus. And then where pelvic inflammatory disease is really likely is if it makes it into the uterine tube. So if it makes it into the uterine tube, it doesn't necessarily mean that the woman even knew that she had it. But during the healing process, fibrosis can go on, and fibrosis, which is scar tissue formation, can narrow the tube. And the two disorders, if untreated, that are really likely to cause pelvic inflammatory disease are chlamydia and gonorrhea. But it also could be a non-STD bacterial infection as well. And since it can scar the tube, it can cause infertility. And if you scarred a single tube, by the way, you could reduce fertility by about 50%, because generally speaking, on average, the ovaries ovulate about half of the oocytes from each side. So if you blocked this tube, you could reduce fertility by 50%. If you blocked both, you could reduce it by almost 100%. So pelvic inflammatory disease can occur even with asymptomatic reproductive tract infections. It's one of the reasons why, even if you're not sexually active, If you're an adult, you need to take care of your reproductive tract so that when you decide to use it at some point in the future, you will have all of the choices available to you. Okay, so this can cause infertility, but it can also cause what we call tubal pregnancies, which is a type of ectopic pregnancy. So if you damage the tube such that fertilization could still occur, like sperm are really tiny so they can still get up, but the dividing embryo cannot make it all the way down because of its increased size for implantation, then what can happen is it can try to implant in the tube. And that's called a tubal pregnancy. A tubal pregnancy is one of the types of ectopic pregnancies. Ectopic means out of place. So a pregnancy should occur in the uterus, but if it occurs here, first off, it can't be carried to term. You will the woman will still have a lot of the symptoms of pregnancy in the early stages. If she did a pregnancy test, it would turn out positive. But this is non-viable, and generally speaking, if the woman tries to carry it to term, it is life-threatening for her. Now, sometimes they will spontaneously miscarry, but if they don't, she's going to have to go in and have medical intervention to have that ectopic or tubal pregnancy removed. Now, not all ectopic pregnancies occur in the tube because this is open and the sperm can make it all the way up. They can also make it out. And this is not ovulated directly into there. So if the egg is out here and the sperm is out here and fertilization happens out here, it can try to implant somewhere else in the peritoneal cavity. So it can implant on mesentery or on an intestine or on the outside of your bladder or on the outside of the uterus. Almost invariably, those also cannot be carried to term. They will also show up as a positive pregnancy test, and they are also life-threatening for the woman. The only thing that I've ever found that could actually be carried to term about an ectopic pregnancy was 2 journal articles that I found about a pregnancy actually implanting on the outside of the uterus instead of the inside. So it had access to all of the same blood flow. And these 2 women carried these pregnancies to term, and one, well, almost to term, to the beginning of the 3rd trimester. And one of the women was able to deliver a living infant, and the other one, the infant didn't make it. And in both situations, the women almost died. So ectopic pregnancies are a big deal. Okay, so now let's move into the uterus. Okay, so the uterus is the location in which the embryo will implant and continue development. It's also called the womb. As far as a mid-sagittal view of where it is, and do make sure that you can identify these on a mid-sagittal section. As far as on a mid-sagittal section, where do these, so here is the uterus. It's a really thick muscular sac, and here's the urinary bladder. And so many people will mix those 2 up, so make sure that you can tell vagina to uterus, urinary bladder, of course, to urethra. Okay, so here's the uterus on a mid-sagittal section. Of course, one of the functions of the uterus is that it is the womb for a developing fetus, embryo/fetus. And so here it is with the fetus actually in it. So the placenta will develop at the site of implantation where that embryo actually stuck to the wall. The placenta will develop, and then all of this happens, of course, much later. Okay, so the uterus is like anterior. Let's just find it. It's kind of anterior to the rectum. It's right here. So here's the rectum, right? And if you follow it and go anterior, it's there. It's posterior and superior to the urinary bladder. It's hollow, it's thick-walled. It has a relatively small lumen, except during pregnancy, when of course the lumen is going to be huge. And the size of the uterus in a woman who has not had a pregnancy, especially a pregnancy that's been carried into the 3rd trimester, then it's about the size of a pear. And in a woman who has had a pregnancy, it's going to be much bigger, and it's not ever going to go back to its original size after carrying a pregnancy almost to term or to term. Okay, so let's look at the portions of the uterus. So here's the fundus, right? That part that looks like a trampoline on the top. It's the dome-shaped region above the uterine tubes. The portion that makes up most of the uterus is this portion right here called the body of the uterus. Then it starts getting narrow right here at the isthmus. And then this portion right here that actually dips into and is surrounded by the vagina is called the cervix. And the cervix has lots of collagen. Its job, among other things, is to, if a pregnancy occurs, to keep this relatively closed until the pregnancy has developed all of the way. So we'll talk about the cervix again in just a second. So let's make sure that you can find the cervix on a mid-sagittal section as well. So this region right here, where the uterus actually projects into and is surrounded by the vagina, that's called the cervix. Okay, by the way, when a woman is about to give birth, they look for dilation of the cervix. And dilation of the cervix is generally an indication that the baby is ready to come out. So they're looking for the cervix, which is almost completely closed, to dilate to about 10 centimeters, which is really small to get a baby head out of, but apparently works. And when pregnancy occurs, do you see before parturition or birth, the cervix stays pretty closed? At least in a healthy pregnancy, it stays pretty closed. Okay, so some supports of the uterus. What keeps the uterus in place? Okay, so we have, although you can't see them here, there are the muscles of the pelvic floor. I'll show you them in just a second, including the pubococcygeal muscles that sort of hold everything up there. There are the lateral cervical or cardinal ligaments, these guys right here, okay, also transverse cervical, and they attach down here at the bottom, and they attach to the pelvic wall. They also hold on to the vagina. You have the round ligaments, these weird ones right over here, and although it sounds totally strange, the round ligaments actually extend from the fundus of the uterus all the way up there toward the pelvic wall. They run through the inguinal canal, and they actually insert onto the labia majora, which doesn't seem to make a whole hell of a lot of sense, but these also exist in a male. They, of course, don't attach to the uterus, but they exist in the male. And then lateral cervical, and then round ligaments. And then this guy, don't forget that we already talked about the broad ligament. The broad ligament is the big wide one that sort of holds on. So let me show you where your pubococcygeal muscles are on the mid-sagittal section and why these are really important for keeping everything up here. The muscles that form the pelvic floor right here are called the pubococcygeal muscles. And these muscles, if they stay intact, they help keep your junk up there. It's really important to keep them intact, especially after pregnancies. Sometimes a whole bunch of big-headed pregnancy babies can destroy these muscles, and you can get uterine prolapse, in which that actually flops out. Okay, so now let's look at the tissue layers of the uterus and meet a tissue that you don't have anywhere else, hopefully. And so what you're looking at here is they're taking a chunk of the wall of the uterus, and we're going to talk just a little bit about what you find in the wall of the uterus. So if you go from the outside to the inside, you've got the perimetrium on the outside. And the perimetrium is the visceral peritoneum that's covering the outside of the uterus. And then deep to that, you're going to run into the myometrium. And the myometrium is 3 thick layers of smooth muscle. It's really thick. And contraction of this will help expel the fetus during childbirth and also expel the endometrium during menstruation. And so contraction of that occurs. And sometimes that contraction is not very comfortable. Okay, and then the inner layer is called the endometrium. And the endometrium is this inner layer right here. It is composed of a really vascular tissue. It's epithelial-like near the lumen, but it's not that simple. So what it actually has is This inner layer is called the functional layer, and then the inner layer closest to the lumen is called the functional layer, and then this basal layer right here is always around. So the basal layer is close to the myometrium. It's permanent, and it's got a whole bunch of glandular secretion in it. And what happens is when the ovaries tell the uterus that an implantation in pregnancy is possible, the basal layer will start making a new functional layer each cycle. It will go through cell division and make this new functional layer. And the new functional layer is really vascular with a lot of glands in it and arteries going all the way to it, arteries and arterioles going all the way to it. And so it makes this really vascular layer that is the site of possible implantation. And that's called the endometrium. And we'll get to endometriosis in just a second. Okay, so what will happen each, in a typical anatomical female's cycle, the functional layer will build up in preparation for a possible implantation with high levels of progesterone. And then as soon as the progesterone drops, you will slough off that functional layer and you won't build another one until the next time the progesterone is high. Okay, so as far as blood supply to the uterus, the internal iliac arteries give rise to a branch called the uterine arteries, which runs through the broad ligament to give blood supply to the uterus, and you can see that. Okay, so let's talk briefly about endometriosis. Endometriosis is a very interesting and also really, really difficult disorder. So with endometriosis, so what should happen is that the buildup of endometrium should be limited to the lumen of the uterus, so lining the lumen of the uterus. But in some women, for reasons that are not completely understood, it does not limit itself to the lumen of the uterus. It starts to grow up the uterine tubes, even out into the peritoneal cavity. So let me show you what that kind of looks like. So top picture. Top picture is a healthy uterus. So these are behind, right? So top picture is a healthy uterus and reproductive tract. This bottom picture that you're seeing is showing you the irritation and the growth of the endometrium outside of the uterus. So this is endometriosis. Endometriosis is difficult to understand. It's not a cancer, because it actually respects the boundaries of the peritoneal cavity. Like, it can grow all the way up to the diaphragm, all the way up there. And what happens is with every month, every cycle, what will happen is the endometrium will build up during high levels of progesterone, and then you'll try to slough it off when the progesterone drops. And that's all well and good for here, even though it's still sometimes really uncomfortable that that occurs. But these tissues have not evolved to have tissue torn away from their wall every single cycle. And so it can cause scarring of course, the uterine tubes. It can cause lots and lots of pain when it builds up along your intestines and your mesentery and then pulls off. And so the tissue is fine when it gets pulled off because it just gets reabsorbed. But the pain and the scar tissue formation associated with endometriosis is really, really difficult, and the infertility is really likely with endometriosis. What the heck do you do for it? You can do interventions in which you laser off the endometrium where it's growing. It doesn't guarantee that it won't come back. You can use hormone therapy, because sometimes if you can mix up your hormones just enough, it will reduce the endometriosis recurrence. Sometimes pregnancy reduces endometriosis from coming back, and then sometimes women just have to choose to do a hysterectomy because the endometriosis is so quality of life impact, has such great quality of life impacts that they actually have to go and choose to remove the tissue which is likely to give them more endometriosis in the future. Okay, and then another disorder associated with the female reproductive tract is cervical cancer. So let's talk about cervical cancer. So cervical cancer, of course, occurs in the cervix, and it is the third most common gynecological malignancy. It's the eighth leading cause of cancer-related deaths, but there's really, really good news about cervical cancer because it's actually a really slow-growing cancer, and as long as you are having regular reproductive health checks, including pap smears, you can catch cervical cancer in the precancerous stages, or even if you catch it in the cancerous stages, your likelihood of survival are very, very high. So what cervical cancer, many cervical cancers, but not all, are associated with exposure to HPV, which is an STD, STI, caused by the human papillomavirus. And human papillomavirus, there's multiple different kinds of human papillomaviruses. There are a few kinds that are really, really likely to cause cervical cancer, but not just cervical cancer. They also cause penile cancer and oral cancer. And interestingly, before they become cancerous, a lot of times they're asymptomatic and they're given from person to person. The rate of HPV in Utah in sexually active people is actually very, very high. So what happens is, let's say this woman was exposed to one of the forms of HPV, which has a really high likelihood of causing cervical cancer. She may have never even been known that she was exposed to it. And she may have had no symptoms. But fast forward a few years, 5 years, 10 years, if she is not getting regular pap smears, in which a doctor named Papanicolaou figured out that if you do regular scrapings, generally yearly, unless you've had an abnormal one, and then they do it more frequently, if you do regular scrapings of the epithelial tissue of the cervix and send them off to a pathologist, you can detect abnormally dividing cells before they become cancerous, and then you can intervene and they can, for instance, ablate the tissue off. They can do surgery if they need to. A lot of times it's not even very invasive in the early stages. So a pap smear, I'll show you what that looks like. Okay, so what they do is they take, it looks like a teeny tiny little toilet brush, although there's different tools that you can use, and they scrape off the epithelial tissue, some epithelial tissue of your cervix, and they put it on a slide and they send it off to a pathologist. And normal epithelial cervical cells look something like this, but when they're abnormal, they start having weird cell division predispositions. And this person would, for instance, get a report back saying that she had an abnormal pap smear. It doesn't mean she has cancer. It means that she needs to go back, have a better check, and then if she has these abnormally dividing cells, then she needs to check more frequently to make sure that nothing becomes cancerous. If it is cancerous, then there's still a lot of treatments because this is not a very aggressive type of cancer. So annual pap smears, which most of us need if we are going to have access to prescription birth control, are basically, they're not even related to birth control. They're just basically your gynecologist or your OBGYN rooking you in to coming and getting a health check if you also want birth control. Now, it's really important for even women who have not, are not having sex or are not having heterosexual intercourse to take care of this, because even if you're not a heterosexual woman, you can still get HPV passed from person to person. And so you still need a pap smear even if you're not using birth control, for instance, to take care of this predisposition to a relatively slow-growing cancer that can occur with sexual activity. Okay, now pap smears are so good at reducing the likelihood of a person getting cervical cancer or dying from cervical cancer that the last time I looked, more than 50% of women with cervical cancer had never had a pap smear. So a disproportionate amount of the women who actually got cancer are women who had never had a pap smear. So this is necessary for your long-term health and your reproductive health as well. Okay, so now let's talk about the vagina. Okay, so a couple of different functions of the vagina. So let's figure out where it is. Yeah. Functions of the vagina. Let's look at a mid-sagittal section first. Okay, so mid-sagittal section, make sure you can find the vagina on a mid-sagittal section. So here's the vagina and here's the uterus. A couple of different functions of the vagina. Of course, the vagina is, during heterosexual intercourse, it receives the penis and potentially the semen during intercourse. It is also the birth canal. If you have a vaginal delivery, this is the birth canal. And then if you have an unfertilized oocyte, what it will do is it will move from the ovary through the tube, the uterine tube, into the uterus. And then if fertilization does not occur, which it doesn't most of the time, then you're actually going to expel the unfertilized oocyte through there. So those are all of the functions of the vagina. It is inferior, connected to the uterus. It's anterior to the rectum, right? And it's posterior to the urinary bladder and also the urethra, right? So it's longer than it looks. And then as far as the parts of the vagina, let's go back to here. Okay, let's find that other picture. Where are you? Okay, this one. So here's the vagina. This region right around the cervix right there is called the fornix, right around the cervix. And then the folds in the vagina are called rugae. We call folds rugae whenever we find them. They make the walls of the vagina highly stretchable. That's really important for, of course, childbirth. But then the folded wall of the vagina also increases stimulation on the penis, which increases the likelihood of ejaculation in the male. And this is a picture of the vagina. So you can see this region right here where the cervix kind of pokes in. So this would be the this would be the fornix, and then you're seeing the rugae. This is actually the cervix and the opening of the cervix right there. Okay, so let's look at what the vagina is made of as far as tissue, although you've already learned that before. Where is that? Oh, here it is. Okay, so the tissue layers of the vagina, so if you look at the inner layer of the vagina, remember you actually learned this all the way back at the beginning of the semester. The inner layer of the vagina is made of moist stratified squamous epithelium, okay? And this is the mucous membrane of the vagina. And it's got rugae. You're not really seeing the rugae in this picture. And this moist stratified squamous epithelium actually has secretory capacity. It actually secretes glycogen, which when it hits the lumen of the vagina is becomes slightly acidic. And so the vagina is actually inhospitable to many, many pathogens because it's slightly acidic, and my anatomy professor always called it the hostile vaginal vault, and he liked to joke that some were more hostile than others. Okay, so in addition, by the way, interestingly, because the hostile vaginal vault has this slight acidity, some vaginas are hostile to some semen and sperm, and that can actually cause infertility issues. Interestingly, in the animal kingdom, outside of humans, this is very, very likely to occur when two animals are very closely related. The vagina and the semen are really inhospitable to one another. It causes irritation in the vagina, and sometimes the vagina actually sloughs off the inner layer because of this irritation. So what is that telling you if, for instance, you are sloughing off the inner wall of your vagina when you have sex? Maybe that person is very genetically similar to you, whether they're related or not, who knows? But that's the way it is in the animal kingdom. Okay, and then if you move in from the lumen of the vagina in, you are going to run into smooth muscle, and the smooth muscle is going to contract upon arousal, upon climax, The smooth muscle can contract. And of course, upon childbirth, it can contract. The opening to the vagina is the vaginal orifice. So let's look all the way back at this picture right here. So this is the opening to the vagina right here, the vaginal orifice. Okay. So again, oops. So vaginal orifice right here. And it is, of course, between the external urethral orifice and the anus. So, believe it or not, a lot of people do not know that the woman has 3 holes and the male has 2 holes, but you will know that. So the opening to the vagina is the vaginal orifice. Now, this isn't in your textbook for reasons I seriously don't understand, except that it's not particularly anatomically important unless there's something abnormal about it. The opening to the vagina is partially to completely covered with folds of skin, a thin, usually thin fold of skin called the hymen. So here are some variations in hymens. Okay. So here's what a typical hymen tends to look like. If this is the vaginal orifice, then the normal hymen looks like that. You can have a smaller one, you can have a much thicker one. There are even hymens that are almost completely imperforate. Now they have to be, they have tiny little holes because otherwise the woman couldn't menstruate, but they don't have very big holes at all. So let's talk about historical and cultural significance of the hymen and whether there is generally any anatomical significance of the hymen. So the hymen can be ruptured, of course, with the first intercourse, right? So historically, in many cultures, it has been used as an intact hymen is evidence of virginity, which is a social construct anyway. But it is evidence that the woman has probably not had vaginal intercourse. But it's completely undependable for that because there's a whole bunch of ways that you can rupture a hymen. You can rupture a hymen via sports activity, via falling, via almost anything, especially if it's a tiny one like these two, and via insertion of a tampon. And masturbation. All of those things can rupture a hymen. So it's really not evidence that a person has not had intercourse if the hymen is intact. And some hymens are so small that they're not actually changed very much by vaginal intercourse either. It also can, by the way, get ruptured during a pelvic exam. So if you have one that's like this, sometimes it prevents normal vaginal intercourse from occurring. And it's completely intact, and sometimes it has to be surgically opened before the woman can have vaginal intercourse. Now, what's really tragic is when one like this, or maybe even like this, occurs, and neither of the people who's involved has any education about the fact that there should be a hole there. And what has happened, and there are journal articles that show it, is if neither of the partners is actually educated that there should be a hole here, and it doesn't give during the attempt at vaginal intercourse, people can end up having sex through the urethra, which will, of course, cause urinary tract infections, cause incontinence, and can cause damage to the urethra itself. And like I said, there are journal articles in which that occurs. So it's one of the many, many, many reasons that I am absolutely not that you asked, but I am not pro-abstinence only education. It doesn't seem like ignorance is ever the way that you can protect yourself best. Okay, last little tidbit about the female reproductive tract is just this, and that is looking just at the whole pregnancy, fertilization. I don't know if you guys know this, but it's an interesting thing to think about, sort of the whys and what can be done about it. Although the United States is very wealthy, our healthcare system, as is indicated by what's going on right now, quite often leaves a lot to be desired. And one of the things that I think that I know that is looked at from country to country, to look at how robust a healthcare system is the maternal mortality rate. And I don't know if you guys have any idea where the United States falls compared to a lot of developed countries in maternal mortality rates. This only goes up to 2015, but it's from a reputable journal, which is The Lancet, which is a famous medical journal. And I want you to look at the maternal mortality rate, deaths per 100,000 live births of the United States compared to a lot of developed countries. So in Finland and Denmark and Italy, this was in 2015 again, but 90 to 2015, you see maternal mortality rates falling. Finland was the lowest in this study, and it was at 3.8 deaths, maternal deaths per 100,000 live births. And then look at the US since 2000. Our rate has been going up. This, interestingly, the maternal mortality rate is outrageously higher in women of color than it is in other women for reasons that really, really need to be properly investigated, understood, and then addressed. So, okay. So let's see, how long have I gone? Don't know if I can tell. Oh, I'll show you guys some sperm too.
Mammalian sperm are flagellated haploid cells. Each cell has a distinct head, middle, and tail region. The head region contains the nucleus. The tail is constructed of microtubules in the same pattern seen in cilia and flagella. The slightly thickened region behind the head contains the mitochondria. The head contains enzymes to penetrate the layer of cells surrounding the egg.
Okay, I don't think I can go for another hour, so I think I'm going to have to divide this and do another short video about the male reproductive tract. So I'm going to go ahead and post this one, and I'll probably get the other one up by Saturday. Okay,